J. Allen Hynek was an astronomer, professor, and ufologist, notably known as a scientific advisor to UFO studies undertaken by the U.S. Air Force under 3 projects: Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book, all between the 1940s and the 1960s. I sat down with Paul Hynek, CFO, professor, Bitcoin, and psychedelic enthusiast, to learn a little more about his father's fascination with the occult, the concept of spirituality within both their lives, and how his father lived his life by an astronomical schedule, along with Paul's interest in the psychedelic DMT. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Paul, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. Your father is one of the most notable ufologists ever. An amazing man, an astronomer. He worked on Project Sign, Project Grunge, and Project Blue Book. So I have so much respect for him and yourself, and I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
I'm tickled pink to be here, Chrissy. Tickled pink, I said.
Tickled pink. That's I'll take that as a compliment.
Indeed, it is.
Thank you. So let's start off just simply. What was it like growing up with J. Allen Hynek? Like, what was it like growing up with a father that was so interested in UFOs? Because I know he didn't start by liking UFOs. He kind of fell into it. But what was it like with a father that had an interest and was doing so much research in the subject?
Well, I think however you grow up is normal to you until you get a little bit older and you look back at it and you say, oh, this was good, that was bad, etc. Now with the hindsight of looking back, it was fascinating. There were 5 of us kids. There's 3 older ones and then a gap, then me and my little brother. And my father, we didn't really think of him as a UFO guy per se, but as a scientist, because as you mentioned, UFOs were sort of a later life pursuit, kind of a side hustle, so to speak. So we thought of him as a professor. That was really his main sort of identity, and an astronomer, astrophysicist, scientist, and then UFO guy. So we had lively discussions at home. We weren't religious. So we talked about science and discovering things and learning. My younger brother and I used to dig holes in the backyard, and my older brother Joel made a pulley system with buckets around a lawnmower engine to take the dirt out of the ground. And my mom had a rule that if she came and looked down and couldn't see every body part of every person in the hole, we had to fill in the hole, start digging another hole. That was the only rule that we had. And my brother and I were put on television in Chicago, where I grew up, because of all the things we found in the backyard. So my father would just walk by and then say, carry on, very good, very good. Because they were happy to have us be curious about the world around us, and didn't have to do with UFOs. It could be the exact opposite, like digging into the ground. And we had scientists and UFO people and reporters over all the time. So it's just a really interesting, intellectually stimulating upbringing.
How did he, as a little boy, how did he explain UFOs to you? Or was it later on in your life when you were a teenager that you started to kind of understand what was going on in the phenomenon? But how would he explain it to you?
Well, I don't know life without UFOs, so it was as natural to me as anything else. We had flying saucer ornaments on the Christmas tree, so they were always there. So it wasn't really like something like, hey, Dad, there's this really weird part of what you do, and I need to know more. Tell me what that's about. I just, we'd be having dinner, and there's Travis Walton or somebody over for dinner talking about their experiences, and I thought everybody saw UFOs. I mean, it just seemed so common to me.
Yeah, you had no paradigm shift.
No, and it wasn't like an epiphany or road to Damascus moment where like, aha. For a while, for years, my bedroom was the largest UFO library in the world. So there are all these books on the wall, and I hated it. I didn't want a bunch of UFO books on the wall in my bedroom.
And I know that from what I read, and you can tell me if I'm right or not, but your dad lived his life by astronomical events, and Comet's Hale-Bopp was one of them. Like, obviously he was an astronomer, but why did he live his life and gear that into his lifestyle and who he was? Why did he find that so significant?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if he engineered things around astronomical events, but when he was born in 1910, they took him up on the roof of the hospital to see Halley's Comet. And he predicted in a TV show that he would go out with Halley's Comet, like Mark Twain had come and gone before him. And so in 1986, I'm living with my mom and dad in Arizona. He's suffering from terminal cancer. And I took him out in the desert to see Halley's Comet again. So he did have that kind of astronomical bookend, which was when you're grieving for, a parent, to have some kind of event of astronomical significance helped it go down a little bit better.
And to me, there might be, if there's a spiritual connection to that, was your father then, did he ever, like, UFOs is such a large topic, and not saying as a religion, but was he a very spiritual man, and did he ever look at the phenomenon in that way as well?
Yeah, he was, he had Rosicrucian leanings. So he was what I would consider a spiritual guy. And there's another thing that comes to mind in terms of like astronomical events. When my father died, he asked to have his ashes distributed in the lake where we have a summer cabin in Blind River, Ontario, Canada.
Oh, no way.
And,
I knew you were in Ontario, but I didn't realize that it was that river. It's amazing.
Yeah, Blind River. I'm just about halfway between the Sioux and Sudbury. So I've gone there almost every summer of my life. It's a very special place to my father and our whole family. So sure, in 1986, we gathered there in a boat, went out from our dock, and found in the middle of the lake, looked around and distributed his ashes. And when we're done, we looked up and we saw a rainbow. We thought, well, that's kind of cool. So now fast forward 10 years, my mom dies in 1996. Same wish. So the same 5 kids go out. This time, there's some grandkids back at the cabin. And we get about to the same place where we had spread my dad's ashes, and we distribute my mom's ashes. And we look up and we see a rainbow again. And we said, well, that's pretty cool. Then we talk a little bit and look up again, and now we see a double rainbow. So we thought that was perfect. So we go back to the cabin, and one of my nieces comes running up to us and says, hey, everybody, look, I just found a picture I drew of Mimi from years ago with a rainbow. So
gosh, Paul.
Yeah, it just made it feel really good. And then flash forward again to the set of Project Blue Book, the TV show about my mom and my dad. And I was on set and walking with Jackie Levine, the executive producer, over to Craft Services for lunch. And she had asked me what my parents would really think about the show. I said, I think my dad would have thought, oh, it's a rip-roaring good yarn. It's really a lot of good fun. I think my mom would have said, oh, it's a bunch of nonsense. You don't need me in there. So as we're walking over to lunch, I look up and I see one rainbow. I said, see, Jackie, my dad would have liked it. My mom, not so much.
That's unbelievable. I'm like, and how can you not have that spiritual connection to that? That's unbelievable.
And, in terms of like orienting life around astronomy, so my father, eclipses were a big deal for our family. And my father would go around the world to see eclipses. And in 1973, he told our family, my younger brother and I and my mom, we're going to Africa. Well, okay, that's cool enough. But we're going on a cruise ship, even better. And we're going to see a total eclipse of the sun. Now that's the best, off the west coast of Africa. And then it got even better because he said, and there's going to be Isaac Asimov and all these astronauts on the ship. But there's going to be one family that will have all their meals together with us at a table of honor. And that was Neil Armstrong.
What?
This is 4 years after the moon launch. I'm an 11-year-old kid who loves space. So now we're having all of our meals for 2 weeks with Neil Armstrong and his family.
Wow.
And there's an article that came out in The Sun in the UK a couple of years ago where they found the documents that showed that it was Neil Armstrong who requested to sit with our family.
No way.
He was very interested in UFOs, and he flirted with the idea of starting up another institute to study them with my father. But he was a fairly reclusive man, and it just wasn't the right thing for him in his public image.
And that's so unfortunate, and that might have that would have changed ufology in so many ways too if he decided to do that.
Mhm.
Has it ever been spoken about his family continuing something like that?
No, and I know his kids. I was, I kind of grew up with them for
Yeah,
2 weeks on the ship. Um, but I mean, there have been a lot of astronauts who've come forward and said that they've also experiences. I'm sure you probably talked to some of them.
for sure.
Um, but it was just that's an example that came to mind of how astronomical events were really big parts of our lives.
Oh yeah. And your father's so amazing because outside of just the astrological events and the interest in ufology, he had a major interest in the occult. Along with one of his best friends, I would call him his BFF, Jack Valet. I would say
Right.
that, and I always see in books and stuff like that if they're always kind of like poking at each other and poking the bear for fun, but they had this major interest in the occult, and I believe it was Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. That was a book that your father had. Why, why was the occult so important to him and interest? I didn't even say important, but interest to him.
Well, my father, when he was 7 years old, decided he wanted to be an astronomer. Um, and what he wanted to do was push the envelope of mainstream science that much further to the edges. Um, and so for him, he had a healthy respect for mainstream science and the scientific method, which he inculcated in us children. But he had a very open mind to things that weren't embraced by mainstream science. I think, I think there are two kinds of people in the world: those who are okay with questions they cannot answer, and those who are not okay with their answers being questioned. So my father felt you should keep an open mind, even in face of, let's say, increasing evidence of a phenomena that you might find unbelievable, inconvenient, unpleasant, whatever. And I think that's where a lot of people have problems with UFOs. They're open in general to the idea, but they say, oh, there's evidence of UFOs, but where do they come from? Well, that's a separate matter. You can say there's evidence of a phenomena here that seems to be, as my father would say, meta-terrestrial. It doesn't mean they come from other planets. Doesn't mean they come from another dimension. Could be one, could be both. But many people have a hard time getting to that spot of saying, wow, there's a phenomenon here, and I have no idea where they come from or what they eat or why they're here. So my father was very comfortable having an open mind with unanswered questions. And if that's the way you think, I think the occult has a great big attractive beacon light that will pull you in.
For sure. And was there any work or other research that he did within the occult topic
Well,
along
so
with maybe with Jacques Vallée?
yeah, well, I think there are a lot of people who would classify UFOs as occult,
Totally.
right? So there's kind of blurry lines between these phenomena. And indeed, one of my main research interests is in seeing if there's a link between experiences that we classify, like Western medicine. If you have a pain in your knee, they'll call it Osgood Schlatter or something like that. They're a very localized thing. So I'm interested in if UFOs and ghosts and remote viewing and entities that people see or report seeing while they're under the influence of psychedelic drugs are actually maybe the same thing. Maybe it's the same consciousness that instantiates in different ways or that we perceive in different ways. And I think it's the same thing if when we talk about occult or unexplained, which is an even more generic umbrella term, if you're trafficking in one facet of the unknown, it's maybe a baby step to other aspects of the unknown that are either shunned or not embraced by science. So I remember when I was a kid, my father would take me to the Harold Sherman ESP conference, I think
Wow.
3 years in a row. And there were psychic healers and all manner of people that had nothing to do with UFOs, but my dad just thought it was interesting, and he knew that I was very interested in that.
Your dad was so open-minded,
Oh yeah,
so
yeah,
open-minded.
yeah.
And unfortunately, we see that a lot of scientists or astronomers or whoever it may be are not open-minded in that. He must have been ridiculed. And
He
I'm not
was
sure if, yeah, and Northwestern, I read, wasn't very
hated it.
happy.
No, they
Yes.
hated it.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
unfortunately.
he was fairly prestigious when he accepted the job as chairman of the Department of Astronomy and he was granted tenure. So there wasn't really much they could do about it, but they just hated it.
Yeah, here's the thing though, when you have somebody who's, Spielberg goes and makes a movie and sheds light on one of their most amazing astronomers that's working at Northwestern, and brings a light to that school as well, you would think that they would have some more positive feedback.
It was the color of that light that they shed that Northwestern took issue with.
Really?
Yeah, they just didn't, they wanted my father to write, more articles and books about astronomy and make discoveries with observatories and things. It's just, I mean, and that's fairly common for academia in general.
For sure. Yeah.
And you mentioned about other scientists not embracing it. Part of it is that there's, the CIA was active with paid disinformation efforts. And there's that
100%.
old axiom about the devil, right? What's the best way for the devil to make people not worry about him? Well, make himself look ridiculous, right? So, but the CIA did that a lot. They just ridiculed and made so many aspects of the UFO phenomenon seem so far-fetched and ludicrous. But I think also a more prosaic explanation for some of the lack of scientists and academics to lean into the phenomena. And that's because if you are, let's say, you're an archaeologist, and you've heard about, say, Graham Hancock and his interesting theories about civilization existing here in North America 20,000 years earlier than popularly thought. Okay, well, you may hear of 5 other such, what you might call fringe theories. You're an archaeologist, and so we think you know everything about archaeology, but an archaeologist will specialize in 4th century BC Mesopotamian archaeology. And if he or she goes to a conference about archaeology, will be very deferential to anything but that. That's not their lane. So you're an archaeologist, and you have somebody like Graham Hancock railing against this dogmatic firewall that's there to prevent the heretics. Well, that's just a little bit outside of your comfort zone to speak publicly about because it's very detailed. You've got undergraduate and graduate students to manage. You've got a grant that you're writing. You've got to keep publishing or you're going to perish in academia. You're traveling and you got a family, and you don't have the time to sort of suss through these various alternative theories about archaeology to determine which one is most credible. And even if you do, there's not really a lot in it for you. So it's just sort of, I think, a prosaic, people are busy rationale or explanation for why a lot of times new scientific ideas aren't readily embraced.
I know, and it's so unfortunate. I've read too that scientists now and even younger are looking to push science to talk about more fringe topics. They actually want to. They want to have that. And majority of scientists do, but unfortunately, you're right. They don't get grants and they're not respected. And it unfortunately never goes forward.
Well,
so,
but that's in part, that's a healthy mechanism because science evolves all the time. But it shouldn't be easy to upturn the apple cart of accepted beliefs about archaeology or astronomy. If it was, we'd have no sort of canon of beliefs. So it's really incumbent upon somebody who's got new theories to push it through. My dad, I think, to his credit, did a lot of work to move the needle in terms of the acceptable or acceptability of discussion about UFOs. It's not easy. It was decades long that it took him. So if you apply that sort of same level of difficulty to other scientists, you got to stick at it for a while. That's just how it's always been in science, whether there was a religious reluctance or not. Most scientists are just looking for the truth, but then when you've been in the field for a while, you sort of develop a vested interest in the status quo because you got a book about that theory and you got grants for that theory. So there's a lot of reasons besides just everybody locking themselves in a intellectual Spartan shield wall to keep the invaders away with their dangerous ideas.
It's true. And I think we see that in a lot of industries too. It's not even just the science world. We see it all over the place too.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the misinformation and disinformation comment that you made. Was your father ever present for any of them? Or did he know of any of them?
Sure. The longest running project with which he was affiliated was Project Blue Book, about 20 years.
Right.
And especially after 1952 with the Robertson panel and a bifurcation with the Air Intelligence Service Squadrons, from which the Men in Black likely came. Project Blue Book was not a serious scientific effort to get to the bottom of the UFO phenomenon. And if they capture craft, reverse engineer the propulsion system and reduce the dependence on fossil fuels and all that. It was, as my father once said, the Society for the Explanation of the Uninvestigated. It was their job to tamp down public hysteria and stamp solved on every possible case they could, not to get to the bottom of it, not a serious scientific endeavor. So that's a kind of disinformation by overly generously saying solved all the time. But even with that military institutional imperative or impetus to always explain everything, they still couldn't explain over 700 cases of the 12,000 that they elected to investigate.
Unbelievable. And he was present at the Robertson panel when they said that they should use the media and Disney as a suggestion to push misinformation and disinformation. So did he, when that happened, did he talk, later on in life, did he talk about that with you and explain, this is how government works and this is what might be going on? Because I can't even imagine myself growing up and my father being part of something like that. It must have been amazing for you. And did he ever have those conversations with you about transparency in government?
Well, we talked about all manner of things. It's hard to remember specifics because when you're a kid, you don't think, I got to remember this conversation for posterity, right? You're just like, hey, Dad, what about this? Okay, now can I put on some rock and roll music?
Yeah, exactly.
We had a rule in the car, whoever's the driver got to pick the music. But one day I had rock music on there. My dad said, what are they saying? I don't know. I said, you don't even understand the words. So I turned it to an opera station. They're playing some Italian opera. I said, Dad, what are they saying? He said, that's not the same thing, bozo.
Did he? Well, and I know the humor was a huge part with yourself and with your family too. I know that was something that was number one. And when I met you in real life, that was one of the first things I noticed. I was like, he has the best sense of humor. And then when I was learning more about your dad, I'm like, this just follows suits. This is a genetic thing right here.
But to 100%. Slam my father a little bit, he had an over fondness for puns. That is horrible.
Yeah.
It was awful.
I remember you saying at dinner, he used to always, I think there was something about a pun, right? Did you have to have a pun to leave the table or something to that extent?
No. If you said 3 puns, you're kicked out.
That's it.
That was it. Yeah.
That's it.
So we had a lot of jokes and puns. And people think one of the things that happened with Project Blue Book, and I'm happy about, is that my father wasn't portrayed as a Vulcan, like Spock, being logical all the time. There's always that tendency. A couple of things happen on TV shows where they have a scientist who they think is really smart. They kind of make him or her the scientist for everything, and they're explaining everything related to science. And in one episode, he's expounding upon deep ocean currents. And I said, well, that's pretty much literally the exact opposite of his field of study. And I already made the point that academics have sort of a narrow, self-perceived lane. My father would not be comfortable speaking authoritatively on deep ocean currents or, plant life in Kentucky. So I was able to dial that back a bit, but that's a very useful Hollywood trope because you have expert. You can't always bring in a new character to be expert. No. And then also dialed it back a bit about him always looking for logic. Physicists don't give a rat's ass about logic. It's physics, it's science, it's gravity, and not logic. So I was able to sort of shaped the tonality of the portrayal of him like that. But he's also a very warm individual who is not on any spectrum. He's very engaging. He could talk to anybody and at any level and just be a fun guy that people thought, hey, he's nice.
I can see that. I'm like, and I think he was relatable to a
Oh, very
degree.
much so, yeah.
Yeah.
But also, as an astronomer who spend a lot of nights observing the sky, you become adept at grabbing sleep whenever you can on buses. Sometimes, because he's also a bit eccentric, you can like lie down on the floor at a party to fall asleep.
I love that though. And that makes him relatable. He's a human,
Yeah,
he's
right.
not stuffy. He's just, he is who he is and he accepts who he is. And I think
Yeah,
that I can see that through you. And I can see that's probably throughout your entire family, I would imagine. And that's an amazing example to have as you're growing up too. It's an amazing father figure to have.
yeah. Something about the self-assuredness of a tenured professor.
For sure. That makes sense. And he's paid his dues, that's for sure. And
Mhm.
championing a topic like this, you know, I hate to move into it, but there is that conversation about Paul Benowitz. And I don't know if you know anything about this. That, your father, and would imagine that this wasn't correct, or if you ever heard of it, but he was they always say that J. Allen Hynek was involved in potentially giving Paul Benowitz misinformation, and maybe not working with Richard Doty, but giving him a computer that was filled with misinformation. And that was, I believe, said by, I'm just looking here, it was Bill Moore, I believe, that said that to Gary Bishop once. And Bill Moore wrote the Roswell incident. So he gave him a computer, and I'm not sure if you know the backstory of Paul Benowitz, but
I don't. I know of Paul Benowitz, and
right.
I don't know anything about my dad giving him a computer. He could have, for all I know. I just don't know anything about that.
Yeah, because it was, unfortunately, it was a big part of, and Jacques Vallée apparently wrote all of that programming that was related into that computer. Always a lot of hearsay, and so I was curious, yeah, if you knew of that, but
I don't.
no, that's fair. The Paul Benowitz story is such an unfortunate story, and it's something that hopefully we at one point we get more information about, because it's just very unfortunate what happened to him and Linda Moulton Howe, and Richard Doty's not the nicest man, that's for sure. Let's just say that. Yeah. How did I want to jump into media then? How, because your dad and this was ghostwritten in the book, the Hynek UFO report, speaks, he talks about all different cases from Project Blue Book, but he really does talk about the media too, and how the media did really play a part in covering these stories. Because you know, UFOs, we always say that it's only in 2017 that the mainstream, really picked it up. And UFOs are way more in the mainstream now than they were before. But there was a lot of outlets and a lot of journalists still covering this topic, from Life magazine, from the New York Times, and a lot of local media outlets covering this.
Yep.
And your father speaks a lot about working with different journalists. How did that play a part, in his life, and how did media play a part of his life? Because even just with Project Blue Book, and then obviously growing older and, having close encounters, talk about his life and his work as well, and him being a part of that. So how did the media, and also, I guess I would say, entertainment, play a part in that?
So he was always very comfortable with the media. In the late 50s, while at Harvard, he supervised the construction and location of 12 observatories around the world to optically track satellites that were about to be launched. And of course, in that October 1957, Sputnik was launched. So there's a lot of footage online of my father giving press conferences and addressing Congress about nothing to do with UFOs, just observatories to track satellites. So he was already very comfortable with the media before UFOs. And, when he first started working on Project Blue Book, I think he was skeptical because, back then they called them flying saucers.
Right.
So that's before UFOs and before UAPs and whatever the next name will be. And one of the things he said to me once was that he could be frustrated with the Tonight Show or a game show sometimes, or a local reporter, because he was a full bird professor. I'm sort of an accidental adjunct professor. Full professors are used to being able to develop a point and take their time in doing so. That's not how the media works. It's more sound bites. And so when you'd have a debate with Carl Sagan or somebody else, he wasn't always comfortable rapidly launching into a quickly rehearsed point that would take 1 minute before the reporter would say, start getting edgy and want to move on. But in terms of just in general about being with the media, in part because he's a likable guy and people warmed up to him. I remember all of our lives as kids, reporters would come over talk about UFOs, or just because he's a well-known local astronomer and professor. So he was very polished, and he wrote a lot of articles about astronomy and not UFOs. So he was known in the media for his, I want to say astronomical exploits, but for his, garden variety, let's say, astronomical career. And so when UFOs came a knocking, he already had a fair amount of media savvy.
So he understood how to work with journalists. Was he ever told, with the American government, how to specifically speak to them, especially when it came to Project Blue Book?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he was told in a lot of ways how to sort of shape the contour of the conversation. And sometimes he bridled against that. And, towards the end of his tenure with Project Blue Book, he was very frustrated because it was very clear that they were not looking for the truth. And it was not a serious scientific endeavor. And James McDonald, in particular, was very critical of him, saying you're lending legitimacy to this effort by having your name involved.
Right.
And he countered by saying, well, there's a lot of research going on here. It's not the kind we would do, but it's still valuable. And I have a seat at the table. I'm able to influence, not control, but influence to some degree which cases are investigated and for how long they're investigated. I think that has value. So I'm just going to suck it up and stay here and do the best I can to change the complexion of this endeavor to be more scientific.
Well, and the persuasion too. He had a lot of power, I would say, with journalists and then within the government, because he is the middleman that is holding that information, and researching that information. So it's so challenging when you're working for the government, but also then wanting to get this information forward and get it clear and make it clear so people know, but then not being able to even have that conversation specifically with journalists. Did he find himself having to work more closer to the government and persuade rather than try to convey the truth?
Well, I think he held sway with the reporters because he was an engaging interview. I think he had no control whatsoever over the government. He was just a pawn in their efforts to control the UFO narrative.
For sure. And I read that in his book, he was saying that the US Army, or the Air Force, sorry, would use stall tactics, lots and lots of stall tactics within around Project Blue Book in specific cases that they knew they just couldn't find answers to.
Yeah, or just come up with a strange explanation, or if need be, unsolved, nothing to see here, move on.
Right. We see that. We see it even now to date, where we look at the US government now doing it and saying, well, all of these are balloons and balloon-like. And we see that in Project Blue Book. We saw that in multiple different projects. Project Sign, those were conversations about balloons too. It's always been the consistent. So nothing's changed. It hasn't. And unfortunately, we see that
the one thing that's changed is that in the old days, they always said everything was a balloon. And now recently, a lot of things are balloons.
Well, right. And that whole question too, which is so interesting, what happened recently with the Chinese spy balloons and then the other balloons that weren't identified, it's this consistent topic. And you would think that we would move on from that. And that always makes me wonder, why are we still having that conversation? Why haven't we been able to identify balloons since all the way from, let's say, Project Sign? Why are they still a consistent, and why haven't we learned to that we should be putting that into our radar? And why can't pilots or other people identify them? Like, why is this so challenging? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of layers to it. On the one hand, you could believe that the Air Force can't detect and shoot down balloons that come from China. Maybe that's true. Maybe they're small. Maybe they fly under the radar envelope. I don't know. Or you could say, you could believe that they do know those things are there and they're doing counter espionage against them, that they are somehow monitoring the balloons and getting information from the balloons. Maybe they tap into their Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth, whatever. And maybe they want the Chinese to think, oh, we can run ramshackle over the US and nobody can do anything. Maybe they're feeding the balloons misinformation from the ground. Maybe they want the Chinese to not know how fast they detect them, because maybe the Chinese balloons or other devices can pick up the moment that we detect the balloons. And now they know what our mission readiness is. I don't know. There's so many interpretations just for these balloons as to what's going on.
I know that you're super into psychedelics, like really, really into psychedelics. How did you get involved in that? And I would love to a little bit know more about what psychedelics you're really interested in.
Well, I smoked. I know it's not a psychedelic, but I did smoke pot with my dad and my mom.
Did you? Nice.
The whole family
I could
did.
see that your dad potentially was a cannabis user. Yeah.
He was not. We were just smoking one night and we passed him the joint and he and my mom took hits on it and they said, oh, what's the big deal? But as a younger person, I had long hair growing up in the 70s in Chicago, and drugs are so prevalent. I did a lot of drugs, and I can't say there's any concrete bona fide research interest. There were some drugs and I did them and I had fun. I look back at those days and say, oh, some of them I wish I had done. They're a waste of time, or probably not good for your health, or put you in a somewhat skeevy situation. But the psychedelics, to me, those always stood out as being enhancing, being somehow fascinating in ways that transcended the short duration of the active experience. And so a few years ago, I was here in Calabasas outside LA, and I met a guy named Nova Spivak. I'd actually met him before briefly, and we had lunch, and he's the grandson of the famed management consultant Peter Drucker, and one of his claims to fame is that he crash landed tardigrades on the moon, which I think is one of the best resume bullet points I've ever seen.
100%. Yeah.
All right. And he knew about my dad, and he asked me, hey, where did your dad think UFOs come from? I said, well, he's very comfortable saying there's a phenomena, less so about where they come from. But he and Jacques Vallée and others, and me as well, think that the extraterrestrial hypothesis in and of itself is insufficient to explain the phenomena. He goes, okay, that's a lot of words, but what does that mean? Well, I think like maybe interdimensional. He goes, oh, you should read a book called Alien Information Theory. I said, Alien Information Theory, sexiest book title ever. I'll definitely read that. And what's it about? He said, well, so there I wasn't even judging a book by a cover, but only by its title. He said it's about the psychedelic drug DMT and how the author opines that perhaps it's not hallucinogenic, but a different sort of Aldous Huxleyan door of perception. Okay, good, I'm sold. Later that day in that same restaurant, I met a new guy who was introduced to me because friends said I could help him get a movie made, and actually disabused him of the viability of him getting a movie made. And he was talking about things he does and ayahuasca, and he's a facilitator for DMT. I said, whoa, can I hijack the conversation? He goes, well, no, that's what the universe wants. And so he said, well, I have some DMT on me. You want to do some tonight? I said, no, I'm going to Blind River, Ontario, Canada tomorrow, but I could do it in a couple of weeks. And I did. And that began my fascination with DMT, which is the most powerful psychedelic known on Earth. And one of the variants of it is ayahuasca, which is better known. And so the first time I did it, I had the kind of archetypal breakthrough, and I after saying hello, hi, thank you for having me, I said, hey, are you related to what we perceive as UFOs and aliens? And I felt like millions of miles of neurons and synapses firing. And the answer trickles down. We can't explain in a way that you would understand. And that made sense to me. It didn't seem condescending or pat. But if, back to my earlier point, UFOs are related to the Terence McKenna machine elves that people report while under the influence of DMT, or ghosts, or remote viewing, or what have you, that may well be above my pay grade level of understanding. It didn't seem far-fetched to me.
Have you done multiple DMT trips then?
I have.
I know that they say, and I've looked into this too. I haven't done DMT myself, but I've looked into how to do DMT, funny enough. And I've looked into, and this is not recommending people to go out and do DMT. I should just say that off the bat. But they say that there is a way, and it's specifically of like going into about 3 different, I think, inhales of it. How,
Yeah.
and I should, yeah, right. I should ask, how far have you gone down that rabbit hole then with the trip? Because
So
I think you can lightly step into it, and then you can really, really, you could really go intergalactic, if it's a better way of saying it. Yeah.
Yeah, metadimensional. So
Right.
I'm aware
Yeah.
of sort of 5 levels, and there's probably like 1,000 more. And I'll go up like an increasing strength. So you can get a vape pen with DMT cartridges and do it that way. And I'll use the analogy of virtual and augmented reality to explain this. So in virtual reality, which I worked on, Avatar and lots of other medical uses, you have goggles, at least for now, and you, the analog creature, are transported into a digital realm. With augmented reality, you, the analog creature, are at home, and there are sort of digital overlays by means of glasses or holding your phone up in your analog world. So what you were mentioning and what I had the first time was you're transported. So it's a virtual reality type experience. But with a vape pen, you don't close your eyes, you're not unconscious, and you have elements of DMT in your waking life. So that's one form. Next up from there is ayahuasca, which lasts for 6 to 8 hours. You don't typically feel transported somewhere, but you have this spirit that people call abuela, or grandmother in Spanish, comes in sort of nurturing, cathartic experience. Then you have, let's say, changa, which is what you were mentioning. You do the 3 hits on a bong or a pipe, and you may well then feel transported to that sort of common DMT realm. And that's the first experience I had. I did it again that night, and it was more like ayahuasca. It was 45 minutes long, and I felt the energy coming into me, helping cleanse me of like emotional sludge. The next level up from that is 5-MeO DMT, which is what is secreted by the Sonoran desert toad.
Right.
As a
right.
super funny defense mechanism. You come close to me, dude, and you're going to trip balls. It's just hilarious. So, and I've done that. I've done the vape pen. I've done the changa. I've done the 5-MeO. And the changa I did was very much like ayahuasca, but I've not done a purely ayahuasca type experience. And the 5-MeO is you just meet God. It's just bam. There's no colors. There's no machine elves. You're just gone. Then I've heard recently of sort of a combination of psilocybin and DMT. And to me, that's just like psychedelic alchemy. So I've yet to try that, but I'm sure there's other sort of hybrids and variants of it as well. It's, the interesting about DMT is, unlike acid or LSD, it's natural. It's in our pineal gland, and it's coursing through the natural kingdom. Right. And I think one of the reasons it's so fast acting and so strong is that it's already inside us. And instead of just applying a chemical overlay to our brain, it's igniting a latent amount that's already there.
How has it changed your life then so far? Or has it?
It has. And you know, cannabis is largely being legalized, both CBD and THC. Now you have psychedelics such as psilocybin and ecstasy and ketamine that are really enjoying a resurgence of clinical prestige, which they enjoyed until like the 50s and 60s. And a lot of people report, you know, antidepressant benefits and things, especially from ketamine and with psilocybin, you tend to feel connected to things. DMT for me, and in the words of a friend of mine, is such an intense, strong experience. It's not always readily apparent how to integrate that into the tapestry of your daily life. Now, but when you do the vape pen, that's more of already doing it inside your daily life to help you sort of fuse that together. And it's hard for me to say exactly, but it has affected me profoundly, not only in effects on me personally, but that I think it's a viable, promising research avenue, since I think these things all may be linked. DMT is, I think, a shortcut to get to one of these related portals and try to investigate and see if I can come and, you know, bring back some UFO Joseph Campbell elixir to the knowledge tribe. Yeah.
Do you think that it's in the mind or this is actually happening?
So Andrew Gallimore, who wrote Alien Information Theory, thinks it's real. And I'm going to be doing a talk with him at Contact in the Desert, where I know you'll also be doing a talk. I think it's quite possible that it's real. It certainly feels hyper real. And I did it once with a mutual friend of ours and another friend. And the other friend didn't want to do it because he'd had a bad experience with psychedelics as a kid where he felt trapped and he couldn't come back. But by and large, anybody I've talked to, including myself, when we've done DMT, it's not a question of, oh my God, I'll never get back. It's more of, can I just stay and hang out? Because it's just so, it feels like that's hyper real. That is the essence of the universe. And this is all just a bunch of bullshit. And the last time I did it, I didn't feel transported, but I felt that realm that I had previously been transported to had been brought to me. And by the way, when I've done it several times, I hear the spirit saying, welcome back, Paul. Let's resume where we left off before, which is qualitatively different than any other psychedelic I've done, where you have like the same memory state of consciousness that's constant, that's there. So it feels real. And Rick Strassman has a great book called The Spirit Molecule that talks about a lot of clinical experimentation. And I read that, and it talks about kind of the typical experience that many people have. So the first day I did it, I invited a friend who hadn't read anything. And after our experiences, I said, hey, let's do a debrief. Greg, why don't you say first what you experienced? And he hadn't read anything. And he relayed an account very similar to mine. Now, the differences were more in his intention when he took the DMT. And then my experience was similar to what was written about in the book. Now, if it had just been me, because I'm very careful not to believe things I want to be true, I probably would have chalked it up to, well, I read these ideas of what happened. So I wouldn't say tainted, but my mind was primed with that type of experience. So I don't really view that as convincing. But the fact that Greg had the same experience without any priming, any prompting, was more intriguing to me. So I just feel that there's this implicate reality outside of what we know. We've got a paucity of sense capabilities with our five senses, and there's so much going on. You know, we only understand, we have a grossly imperfect understanding of only 5% of the universe. The rest is dark matter and dark light. And we throw our hands up in the air. We have no idea barely how to detect any of that, much less what its properties are. So to me, it's intellectually dishonest to say, oh, there's not that, there's not that. You can say about any phenomena, I haven't seen enough evidence to convince me, and I really don't think there's much, but you can't just rule things out. with DMT, it just goes to a higher level where I think every person that I've talked to who's done it has a sensation that it is indeed real. Now, of course, that could be a chemical reaction. This is the most powerful psychedelic known, but it didn't feel that way to me. So I have that sort of personal conviction that there's something there, and certainly that it's worth my time doing more. And, you know, I'm developing a protocol like my father did with Close Encounters of the First, Second, Third Kind for what I call verifiable evidence, with which I want to inculcate in experiencer communities, ghosts, DMT, UFOs, etc., so that they can bring back what scientists would consider compelling evidence. Because so far we brought back some strange alloys and star maps and, you know, revelations that your Aunt Ginny has the gout and whatnot, and it hasn't moved the needle at all. And I know Michael Shermer and Seth Shostak and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they're intellectually honest people. And if I can bring back evidence, so I'll give you an example. I have 7 categories of evidence: biological, technological, etc. And one of them is mathematical. So let's say you say, hey, I meet with a superior intelligence. It doesn't really matter to me what kind of intelligence that is. Every Friday at 5 p.m., it's super intelligence happy hour. Okay, can you ask them a question to sort of help prove their validity? And you come back and you ask them a super difficult math question, and they come back with it. And you know, it'd be very difficult for you to do. Okay, that's interesting, but you could probably look it up on your phone. So how about this? How about you ask them one of the 7 millennium unsolved math questions that each have $1 million prize associated with solving. You bring back one of those, somebody like Michael Shermer, the founder of Skeptic Magazine, is not going to say, okay, you've proved that aliens are real. He's going to say, you've proved evidence of a superintelligence, either yourself or somebody else, and I would like to learn more. So what I want to do is, instead of us randomly, reactively bringing what we encounter and things that we're told and saying, oh, science, won't you believe us now? Instead, knowing what science wants and, to the best of our ability, influencing that encounter to ask those questions and bring back those answers.
It's so hard to be measurable. I have so much respect for that, because I think it's actually really smart. We have to find a way to measure those experiences, because it might explain a lot of things. It might explain experiences that are happening for people that are having UAP experiences, abduction experiences. Like, there's so much that could be related to that, but measuring it and finding a measuring system, it could almost be impossible. And asking, and what are those measurable moments that you're able to quantify?
Yeah, I mean, it's a Hail Mary at best. But if you can come back with this proof of this sort of other reality, and let's say they are all connected, aliens and ghosts and UFOs and DMT and all that, I mean, you're answering life elsewhere, life after death, meaning of life. Those are pretty big, gnarly, Gordian knot type riddles that have not been solved. And that would have a lasting impact. And so for me, I think my father did a really good job as kind of a UFO alien accountant, because that's what Close Encounters are. It's an accounting system. He laid the groundwork for scientists, because he wasn't studying UFOs. He was studying UFO reports. He came up with a rubric to classify them with. And that's, that's met the test of time. So I want to build upon that framework he did to say, okay, now we have more and more reports of serial encounters with superintelligence. Okay, you say you meet with this person every week, or this entity, let's put it to the test. And if you want to have objective third-party legitimacy, here's what to do.
Is there anyone else doing this type of research that's looking to quantify and measure it? Yeah. It's
sort of like isolated ways. Marco Rodriguez came up with a really good rubric for DMT in particular, using prime numbers. And other people have used specific things. And I think my contribution might be to sort of widen the aperture and say, okay, let's consider all the types of things. I mentioned biological and technological, et cetera, and come up with a scale. of like intriguing, compelling, and convincing, not proof, because scientists don't really use the word proof, but of evidence that they would find compelling. And so here's what we need to get. Instead of asking science to like what we have, let's understand what they like and try to get that.
I agree. Speak to your audience and speak to your audience so that they can speak with you, and then you can have a conversation. I think that makes total sense.
Yeah, and in part, that's because I don't give a rat's ass what the U.S. government has, says, or does. They are a bad faith actor, and I'm tired of them leading us around by the nose these many decades. They just don't care. What I'm interested in is this sort of intersection between, call them believers of these different phenomena, and mainstream science. These are independent from the government. If they can talk better, if scientists could say, wow, you've got something going there now, and the people in the believer communities can understand what science wants and how to speak that, that's how I think we can make lasting and profound breakthroughs.
Back to DMT though, too. I'm curious, and even outside of DMT, this UAP topic, or to say DMT and UFOs, are we opening up Pandora's box? It's scary to think about that, because we are looking at two really unknowns when we speak about them. DMT and what's really happening, we don't really have a lot of knowledge and research. Along with the UAP topic, we have incidences and things that are measurable, but we don't know what they are, and we don't know why DMT does that to us. Are we opening up Pandora's box? And in your perspective, in your thoughts, and then maybe potentially of what your father would think of that too.
Okay, I think I can answer for both my father, especially as regards UFOs, and myself for UFOs and DMT. The boxes are open. People are reporting, seeing that they see aliens. People are doing DMT and seeing these things. So the boxes are open.
Should we be opening them?
Well, try controlling that. I mean, they're open already. People have been doing DMT for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So these boxes have long been open. There's really not much we can do to control it. So what I'm trying to do is figure out what's that box made of? If we come in this side of the box, or these things come out of the box, what happens if we go in the box? What else is in there? Who else is in there? So because I think these boxes are open, and yeah, there's risks of various kinds here, but I, for one, think that if these boxes are open, I'd like to understand them a bit more.
It's scary because there are negative, especially, let's not the UAP topic, but the DMT psychedelic topic. There's you've had some positive experiences that you speak of, but there's a lot of negative experiences, and some people don't come back from that either. And yeah, and I think that's where I get worried, is saying like, I'm so interested and curious in this too, about what's in the box. You're right. What's the box made of? But should we even be doing this? We don't really know what it is. And for example, with ayahuasca and DMT, there are people that are having extremely traumatic events and hallucinations, if they are, or if it's reality to them, whatever it may be. But there are negative consequences that come with that too. It's not always positive, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I'm not proselytizing or encouraging anyone to do any type of psychedelic drug. People are doing them. So
sure. Yeah.
It's not a question of should we open that box, right? That box is open. These things are coming out. So what I want to do is I want to understand more about the essential reality and ground rules of those experiences. So, I mean, to me, at this point, since, to torture that metaphor, that box is open, I think there's more risk in not trying to understand it and just ignoring it than there is in trying to understand a growing phenomenon.
It's true. And I hope we just don't regret opening up Pandora's box.
Well, I mean, but again, we didn't open that box.
That's true. It's true. But I just mean humans in general. But I mean,
ancient cultures did psychedelic drugs thousands of years ago. So, these have been open. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that psilocybin increased brain capacity, right? So
yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
This has been going on for thousands of years. I think the responsible course of action is to understand it a bit more than just let it run wild as it's done all these years.
No, I think I agree with you on that. I think that we need to be able to learn more about it and then figure out how to quantify it and evaluate it and measure it. But then we get to a point now where we're looking at the multiverse. We're looking at things like the Neuralink. We're looking at the beginning of AI and what's going to happen there. And then back to the multiverse, we look at mixed reality. Throw psychedelics in there. What is the future going to look like?
Oh, I wish I knew. And back to your point about people having bad experiences with like ayahuasca and DMT. From what I've read, and Rick Strassman's book, The Spirit Molecule, has a lot of clinical case histories. And I read that very carefully before I decided to do it for myself the first time. And his book, if any listener or viewer is interested, I would read that book if you're interested, because it's a very academic approach to clinical experimentation. And again, it's not like a cheerleading book to do DMT, but very few experiences have been negative with both ayahuasca and DMT, especially if people are reasonably cautious with the environment they do that with the people that they're doing it with, in case they feel uneasy in some way. I won't say a percentage off the top of my head, but I think the vast majority of people who have experienced these DMT and ayahuasca, et cetera, come back with very positive reports, as do I.
Yeah, and I think you're right to say that, because the whole travel and tourism industry within Peru and other countries that make ayahuasca and distribute it now to tourism, and it becoming such a boom is scary, because a lot of people actually have unfortunately died. And I should be saying that. And, just because you do a psychedelic doesn't mean that you will, but if it's not properly done and you are not invested or doing your own research in that, yes, there can be fatal causes with that. And I think that should be known for people. And we've seen that in Peru, unfortunately, with the boom of ayahuasca tourism.
Yeah,
So,
these are very powerful substances, not to be taken
they really
lightly.
are.
And
Yeah.
I think, everybody's brain chemistry, and you can talk about the potential alternate reality behind these. It's a very strong experience, and I think people can react in different ways. And there's so much therapeutic benefit from these types of things if done in a responsible situation, a responsible environment, and with the right intention.
You're right. Yeah. Looking at it is not so much recreational, but you're right. I
No,
think therapeutic.
these are not to be just like, oh, I'm just going to do this.
Right. Right. It's a little more life-changing. That's for sure, compared to other recreational things like cannabis. So thank you so much, Paul. I just want to find out, tell us a little bit more of what you're going to be presenting at Contact in the Desert and what day we can catch you there.
Oh, so I don't know the schedule. Do you know what your schedule is yet when you're
Not
speaking?
fully yet. Not fully yet. I was curious
Okay.
if you knew yours.
So I don't. I'm giving three presentations. One is I call it Growing Up with UFOs. And it's about my family, my father, and what it's like, more in depth than we talked about today. With a lot of pictures and videos of what it was like and how that's influenced me. The second one is about my research interest in trying to produce verifiable evidence. And the third one is the collaboration and conversation with Andrew Gallimore, who wrote Alien Information Theory, because when I read that and Rick Strassman's book, I noticed in the sort of early days of collection of DMT reports, some kind of emergent patterns that seem to be similar to the early days of UFO reports. So Dr. Gallimore and I will explore, are these things possibly related? What are the similarities? And what can involvement in one of these fields sort of lend to the other one? I mean, I don't know the times or dates yet, but you've been to Contact in the Desert. There are 7 things going on at any one time. So it's going to be great. And it's under new management this year, as you know. And it's going to be just going to be a great time, much like Conscious Life Expo was.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to see everybody and hear everyone's thoughts, because it's a really diverse group of people, that's for sure.
Yeah, because it's not just UFOs. They're looking at future stuff and AI and technology as well.
Yeah, they're moving into more of a science realm, which I think is awesome. It's like the future of science, technology, and thankfully UFOs is a big part of that. So thank you so much, Paul. And as I say to all of my guests, thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
My pleasure.